I mean, again, I know these people. I mean, I've met, I mean, in some cases, knew them in graduate school. People who went on to become these admirers of Foucault, Lacan, Derrida, and I know what their training was. Their training was purely within the English department. That's all they ever knew. They never made any research outside of that, right? And so the idea, Foucault is simply this a mechanism. It's like a little tiny kit by which they can approach everything in culture, but the contortions of language, the deliberate labyrinthine elitist language, at the same time as pretending to be a leftist. Okay, this is one of the biggest frauds ever practiced.
So I got a story to tell you that you might like.
I've been like sipping at this Jordan Peterson, Camille Paglia interview, or kind of discussion interview. It was more her than him, but he just really likes to talk. He's great. I love him. And Camelia speaks about the encroachment of postmodernism. So they're talking about postmodernism, and the video is linked to either of those directions. And she keeps on bringing up that in her estimation, what happened is that the English departments began to seep in throughout different areas of academia, and they started to take over the humanities, and they started to implement this postmodern frame of reference, right? And I felt that too when I was going to so I went to Evergreen, if you don't know that, and what I did was I tried to design a Bachelor of Arts degree to advance my ambitions and to perfect or to raise up my talents to the next level, or to continue to advance my mastery of this art. And what I realized when I started studying literature, and then I started studying how people were talking about literature, I saw that there was all these academic English teachers who didn't ever actually produce English literature themselves. They produced literature on top of literature. They produced criticism. And I started to say, well, what right does anybody have to talk about literature if they have never built literature? I want to opine that not any given individual, but in mass, what we have is all these professors who love literature, but who realized at a certain point that they could never make a living creating literature, instead of focusing on how to build literature, because they didn't need to focus on that. Because if they were focusing on that, then they would just be writers, figure out what literature is, how literature operates, and how literature is successful, and how you get that market feedback of success with regards to what you build. And because they saw early on that they could never be successful at that, or they did not pursue success in that way, they began to focus their attention on the dismantling of literature. Perhaps what formed within these different thinkers, or these different critics, was a kind of a resentment against the marketplace. And perhaps to answer Jordan Peterson's question about why these people who say that there is no grand narrative, that every narrative is just equally valid, why these people who believe in radical relativism would eventually kind of form or kind of congregate around Marxism, is because perhaps there's a resentment against capitalism, because within the rubric of capitalism, their talents would never amount to success. So perhaps on the undercurrent, they started to gravitate to an alternative of capitalism. And that alternative, so far, is Marxism. And so you see these people teaching Marxism, or kind of going towards this Marxist kind of rubric, because that is the one story that they can be successful at. So all they do is dismantle literature. All they do is make footnotes within footnotes within footnotes, and they constantly go with all these language games, and they pick things apart and try to make new criticisms, but they're never actually embarking on the adventure, which is literature. Within my designing of my narrative, I thought, well, I don't want to be a creative writer. I don't want a degree in creative writing, because what the heck does that mean, right? Like, every writing is an act of creation. Every authorship is an act of authority. I don't want to just be a creative writer. That just is so wishy-washy to me. And yet I don't want to just be a critic, because a critic is essentially derivative. And so what I thought of, like, just because I'm awesome and cool, or just a pansy, pretentious poet. I'm like, well, I'll design a course of study that I'll think of under the umbrella of narrative arts, right? So narrative arts, what is narrative? And what are all the ways that narrative is assembled? And part of narrative arts is how can you take literature apart in order to make more literature? Like that was the cyclic process that I wanted to discover, the creation, the dismantling, and then the recreation, which might have to do something with how the world works, is that you have creatures who are created and then they die, and then they go through this process of deconstruction, and then they're recreated again in this endless cycle. And I wanted to implement a creative criticality and a critical creativity. And one of the things that I just noticed was that where are the actual authors? Where is that potency of creation? And so I think perhaps, and this is just speculation, and you can totally poke holes in this speculation, is that you have these, what we're thinking of right now as the postmodernists, the skeptics. You have Derrida, you have Lacan, you have Foucault, which if you kind of mix and match that with Anglicization, you have Faux-Cult, the Faux-Cult, or the cult of fauxing everything. You end up never actually creating anything. And so I want to tell a story to cement us here, because I know I'm rambling, but I want to cement us here. This past year at Evergreen, I attended these hiring sessions. They wanted to hire another faculty that would be in charge of composition, of teaching students composition. And I saw these 3 different applicants come up. And one was, she's pretty, but she wasn't that good. And another one was promising, but she was still too young. And I realized with her, I'm like, oh my God, I am 40 and I could have been a doctorate in teaching by now. But of course that didn't work out for me. And then there was a third one who was pretty sharp. And I kind of liked her. I thought she had enough experience, and yet she kept on going back to Foucault. And then when she gave her presentation, so what you do is that you have the teachers, they come in and interact with the class, and then you have the teachers go and give a lecture. And that was the 2 ways to evaluate the teachers. And then they went out for lunch or dinner at Mercado Restaurante, which y'all should check out if you're ever in Olympia, because though I criticize Evergreen, Mercado Restaurante is pristine. So this third applicant for the slot of composition teacher, instead of talking about writing for a lecture, she's like, well, I'm not really interested in writing, I'm interested in film. And so she showed us a film about Turkey or about the Middle East, because she's Middle Eastern, so she got those points. And then she went and deconstructed the narrative. And within her deconstruction of the narrative, I saw her just flinging out these little isms, these little feminist isms, these little post-structural isms, these little catchphrases that and I'm looking around at these catchphrases that she's spitting out. I'm like, I already heard that shit before, but I saw all the, some of the other teachers, Evergreen teachers, like, oh yeah. And the one that got me miffed the most was that this third applicant showed this Turkish film. I think it was Turkish or Armenian. It was somewhere in that area. And there was this scene where there was this young woman who comes into this room, and she's holding a candle, and she goes and she pours some sort of fluid into these different men's cups. And there was 5 or 6 men. And it was a fascinating scene, because this young actress was just cusping into her femininity. And then you have these different men at different stages in their biological arc and their personal arc responding to her. And you have these long shots of these different men responding to her. And I was just fascinated by the way that these men responded to her differently. And then when this third applicant for the composition teacher at Evergreen decided to talk about, she just threw this out, like, oh, the male gaze, right? I can't remember how she even went on from that. She just said the male gaze, and I looked around and certain other teachers like, oh yeah, the male gaze. Yeah, the male gaze. And I'm like, what the hell? What you just did with that one little phrase was collapse every one of those individual men into this male gaze, right? And they're all congregated around this female in this one way. And I'm like, well, wait, hold on a second. What's happening there? What I see happening there is that this woman is possessed of such grace, such a feminine, an essential feminine power, that she shuts off every man. Every man stops being an actant and turns into a supplicant. And so that male gaze is actually the female, what is it? It's not object. There's got to be a phrase for it. I should invent a phrase for that, but I have to keep on rambling. So that female presents a moment in time that is so powerful that a man can only react. And when a man becomes purely a reaction, then you get to see that individual man's content. And so that idea of the male gaze could be completely exploded and shown how actually the woman is the one who has the power over the men, and what she does is elicit that man's individuality, his will, his phallus, his eye, his what is most potent about him that will be continued on if the female so chooses. And so think about this. So you have these people who have learned how to criticize and how to dismantle, but they never actually taught themselves how to be creative because they thought that that was a failed endeavor because of the market or whatever things. But because they have denied themselves the ability to be creative, they've found this cult where they don't have to be creative. All they have to do is obfuscate and create these different terms, but they never actually have to assault the core of their ideology. Actually, they protect the core of their ideology, and so that ideology is insistently non-creative. I don't want to be the strongest critic on the blog. My aim is to be a creator, and criticism is a part of that. And it so happens that criticism works with the marketplace. We love watching people eat things away. Acid and salt are inherently tasting to us, but the flavors which constitute creativity require such a mastery of form that I'm still not ready at that. But I will come down strongly critical of those, and that is basically my whole critique of postmodernism, is that essentially it's impotence. Essentially, what they're doing is teaching young minds how to cheat themselves out of the pursuit of creativity, so that these young minds think that, well, everything is just surface. I don't have to worry about the depth. I was never taught how to get deep with things. I was never taught how to go into the roots and into the foundations. I can just smash all that and call it good. And look at all of my dust. Look at all of the destruction that I've wrought on these evil systems of oppression. And I want to say that what you're actually teaching kids is to just make a splash. And what is a splash going to create but just a bunch of gunky foam on the rocks? That's not truth. That's not power. I don't know what truth is, and I don't believe wholly in power, but I do believe in that which is potent. And I do believe in that which is seminal. And that is why I claim here and now to be an aspiring patriarch, to be an aspiring builder, to say that there are still myths to be wrenched out of the traditions which we have inherited. So that's kind of my response to Camille and Jordan, which I watch a little bit of it and then I get like a little fizzy because like they're both so freaking potent. And that's the thing about these academics right now. And that's the thing about these students right now that are protesting and protesting and protesting. They think they're so potent because they come up with these slogans and they can shout and yell so loudly, but they're not actually creating anything. And they have to shout louder and louder and louder because the fact of the matter is that underneath all that is nothing. Underneath all that is just teeth and spittle. But that teeth isn't getting to the meat of the matter, which is what I'm after. And I hope I drew some blood.